so much for asking me back. Last time we met, in the Garden Hotel, I seem to remember, Wuhan, China was just a dot on the map, and the coronavirus was actually a character in a children's storybook. It's Asterix and the Chariot Race, if your children like Asterix. What a lot has changed. And Paul has very kindly asked me if I just give some personal reflections on the year that's gone past and some thoughts about the future, which I'm delighted to do. So, in early March, I was very excited last year. I was about to launch the American edition of my book, Extra Time, which I spoke here about before. I didn't reckon on the pandemic, which was closing doors even as I spoke at Harvard, where I'm a fellow, and I wrote much of this book. And of course, it was simply the wrong timing to be trying to launch a book that takes a very optimistic view of ageing when we had a disease that was so cruelly ravaging some of the oldest people in our society. I came back to London and I almost immediately got a call from the Department of Health asking if I would go in and help the government during the pandemic, and a role that I thought would last a few weeks actually lasted many, many months, which was a great privilege. And I suppose we saw the good, the bad and the ugly in that crisis. The NHS is an extraordinary organisation. It's usually made up of about 700 different fiefdoms. In this crisis, it became a command and control centre, built the Nightingale hospitals with incredible speed, retrained many, many staff, dental hygienists retraining as respiratory nurses, all sorts of people downed tools, medical students stepped up, and many, many doctors have said to me that actually getting rid of so much bureaucracy and red tape was a wonderful liberator and that we should never go back from that. At the same time, however, the government, local authorities, care homes, quangos and the NHS really struggled to join up with each other, and that's partly why things took far too long, and I think individual actors started to make their own individual choices. I remember a call from Bradford Council who said that they just chartered a plane to Madrid to negotiate for their own PPE because frankly they didn't trust anybody else to get it to them in time. And I will never forget a call one night from a dear, dear friend who's a senior nurse who said to me she wasn't sure she could let her team go from their 12-hour shift because they weren't certain they had enough spare PPE, and those were some of the dark days of the crisis. And we also saw, of course, care homes really struggling because for far too long the world did not realise that so many people could carry the virus and be asymptomatic, and we all know some of the tragedies that resulted. I ended up being asked by the Secretary of State to write a review into the future of health and social care and how they could be joined up better and reformed. And that was tremendously exciting for me to do, trying to build on some of the lessons of the pandemic. And one of the conclusions I came to was that we have to commission care differently. It's not just about how we fund it, although it's important to get more funding. It's also about what do we want old age to look like? Where does the continuum of care, retirement homes, retirement villages, domiciliary care, nursing homes, rehabilitation after you leave hospital, all those things need to be much, much better joined up. And the truth is that no country in the world has done it quite right yet. But we could pioneer those changes, especially if we let workers, the social care workers, do the job they really want to do, which is looking after the whole person rather than being commissioned, often by the minute, to race between people's homes and never be able to build the fundamental relationships that we all know are so, so important to trust and well-being. Now, more broadly, I suppose I feel the pandemic shone light on four things which I hope we can learn from for the future. The first one is, back to those care workers I mentioned, the vital social contribution that has been made by so many low-paid people in this crisis, the postal workers, the truck drivers, the warehouse checkers, the nursing assistants. And actually, those of us isolating in our comfortable houses on Zoom have been very aware of that front line and the risks it has taken. The philosopher Michael Sandel has recently written about what he calls the tyranny of merit, which he believes has meant that a new elite, university educated, rather pleased with ourselves, thinking that our success is all down to our own brilliance, tend to look down on some of those less educated people, and that we have devalued some of those jobs. And he makes a very strong argument for restoring the dignity of work, which I think is essential, and I am now hopeful that something better will come out of this crisis. Another point I wanted to reflect on was the outpouring of community spirit that we saw. I was sitting in a group that was building the NHS volunteer app, which you may remember 500,000 people signed up to volunteer for the NHS in a period of a couple of days. That was double the number that we thought we needed and took everybody by surprise. And in fact, they didn't close the door in time. And for the next few weeks, the Prime Minister kept asking, why haven't we got enough tasks for these people to do? Well, the truth was that in every street, in every neighbourhood, ordinary people were getting on with it. They were delivering groceries, they were finding out who was lone, they were making calls, they were picking up prescriptions. And that is one of the great and heartening things about Britain, that actually we don't wait for the government to do it for us. We get on and do it. And that is the social fabric that is still there, no matter what the media tell us. And I think even in anonymous cities where, many people move to cities because they don't really want to be bothered by their neighbours, I think this crisis has brought us all together and changed the fabric of life so that we're never going to pass those people in the street anymore without acknowledging them. And that's a great thing. Third point I want to make is that the pandemic exposed something I have talked about for many years, which is the deep health inequalities in our country and in the US. Life expectancy is now going backwards for women, some of the poorest women in our country, and it was going backwards for men in the US for 3 years, which is a reversal of decades of progress. And of course, we know that age was the strongest indicator of risk for COVID. But the truth is that although 9 out of 10 people who died of COVID in England last year were over 60, you were far more likely to be at serious risk if you were also obese, if you had diabetes, if you had other underlying health conditions, and in some cases if you were from certain ethnic minorities. And we have to now fix that. It's not acceptable to have a country in which you have 8 more years of healthy life to expect if you live in the south than if you live in the north. The Prime Minister, of course, you'll remember, had his own epiphany because he had a near-death experience from COVID in St Thomas's Hospital. And there was genuinely a moment where his advisors thought he might not pull through. And having been very libertarian on this and very reluctant to tell people how to live their lives or what to eat, he really did have a turnaround, and he dusted off the shelf some policies that I and others had proposed in years past. And I hope we will now see, once this crisis has passed, a much greater emphasis on prevention of some of those diseases, on public health, a much greater expectation that a doctor won't just hand you out a pill for backache, but may help you lose weight, may send you to a dance class, may do what we now call social prescribing, and look at the well-being of the person, not just the individual problem. And the last point, looking forward to the future, this pandemic has shown again what an extraordinary base we have in this country in science. The day that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was announced, I was walking through Kensington Gardens, and there's a huge statue by a fountain in Kensington Gardens, a very black statue, which turned out to be of Edward Jenner. Now, Jenner was, of course, the inventor of the smallpox vaccine, which was revolutionary. And like many of those inventors, he started small and he took a few risks and he injected the arm of some poor stable boy and so on, and he worked this out. And we really have a good record on science. This government is obviously very keen to build on that. And one of the aspects that we are leading on now is genomics. We have actually sequenced more genomes than any other country in the world. And the reason I mention this is because I believe that there are genetic breakthroughs which are going to produce anti-aging therapies quite soon, which will be as important in the 21st century as antibiotics were in the 20th. Now, many of those therapies are based on the discovery of various genes that appear to help us live longer and appear to help certain organisms, particularly mice, which is when most of the studies are carried out, live longer better. They don't have a long period of decline at the end of our lives. And that should be the goal for all of us as individuals, but also the goal of policy. In industrialised societies, we are suffering from this long twilight of senescence at the end of our lives. For some of the poorest people in our country, that period is getting longer. And some of these breakthrough technologies may actually help us to trigger the underlying defence mechanisms in our bodies so that beyond the age of 50, instead of slowly decaying, we actually are able to keep repairing our tissues, repairing our DNA much better. Next June, the world's first human anti-aging trial will begin in America. And that is groundbreaking because it's testing out a prescription drug called metformin, which is usually used for diabetics. It's testing that drug in a large group of older people, and it's trying to see whether the drug actually has effects right across their system, whether it actually improves their health in a number of different ways. Now, conventional medicine tends to treat one disease at a time. But even if we were to cure cancer or heart disease, which would be wonderful, we probably gain only a few more years of life on average. If you could find a mechanism that would unlock the underlying tissues in the body, the cell repair defence mechanisms, we could really make enormous gains. What the US trial is doing is trying to convince regulators that they could actually license drugs that might treat ageing as a condition in itself. And that may sound crazy. I don't believe in immortality, but treating ageing as a condition would simply mean that you were able to actually license a drug, for example, which might seek to improve a number of different biomarkers, the biological measures in your body, which measure your biological age as opposed to your chronological age. So I think there's an awful lot to be hopeful about. And I hope that with the vaccine on the horizon, with new therapies coming on board, later life will once again look rather more attractive than sadly it has done recently. I wish you all a safe, fit and happy New Year. Thank you.